Hey Gordon, do you have a minute?
Yeah, Rich, what's up?
How long before we run out of fuel?
It depends.
I don't understand. Why do we know exactly how much fuel we have on board?
I watched them fill the tank and I know how much we started with, and then I calculated how much fuel we would need for this trip.
Don't we have a fuel gauge on this spacecraft?
Yes, on the instrument panel. But don't pay any attention to it.
Why is it on the instrument panel if we aren't supposed to pay attention to it?
It's only supposed to tell us when we are out of fuel. That is the only time it has to be accurate.
Wouldn't an indicator light work just as well? So, why do we have this fuel gauge, and what is the use of a fuel gauge that only tells us we are out of fuel?
The Federal Space Administration says we have to have a gauge. It is a space regulation.
That's stupid. You mean the fuel gauge can read anything it wants while we are in flight and then has to read zero when we run out of fuel? I think that could lead to problems.
Yes, I read it in a safety briefing. It must be the official policy.
Did you account for the heavy cosmic winds we ran into?
Yes, I used my cosmic wind fudge factor, and we have a new fuel totalizer. The totalizer lets us know how much fuel we have burned in the engine.
Do the feds require us to have a fuel totalizer?
No, it only requires you to have a fuel gauge.
You mean the one that doesn't work and lets you accurately know your engine is going to stop? Or better yet, have a message that says prepare to land, right, now.
Yes, the gauge on the instrument panel. The Federal Space Administration requires it to be there. How many times do I have to tell you that?
So according to you, this gauge can read anything it wants, and then we are to trust it to let us know we have no fuel. And when we have no fuel the engine stops and we crash. I am having a hard time trying to understand why the feds would require us to have this kind of fuel gauge on our spacecraft.
I didn't write the rules. The safety brief said to visually check the fuel before flight, which I did, and then they want me to calculate how long we can fly and leave room for unexpected circumstances. That was my fudge factor I told you about. I am a careful pilot and I don't run out of fuel. That would be stupid. I won't blame a bad fuel gauge for running out of fuel. Blaming misleading instruments is bad piloting.
How can you possibly plan for the unexpected? For example, what if we ran into less cosmic wind on this trip?
We would have more fuel when we landed, and the only times you have too much fuel is when you are on fire or crash. Don't worry, we have a totalizer. The totalizer lets me change my fuel plan and update my calculations.
I fail to see the logic here as well. What if we developed a leak or the fuel cap was not put on right and fuel vented overboard? The fuel totalizer won't be any help then.
That would not be expected, and if it happened we would probably have to crash land.
So the only way we would know that we had a fuel leak is when the engine stopped and the fuel gauge reads zero.
Yes, that is how I understand it is supposed to work.
I am skeptical. According to your logic, a posted note on the instrument panel, with the words 0 gallons written on it, would satisfy the feds.
Like I said many times, I didn't write the rules. Actually, I have seen a fuel gauge with a posted note. The note read, "Enough," and I have to confess the note I saw was on this fuel gauge. So I removed the note and disconnected the gauge. The feds don't like posted notes, so your concept won't work. The disconnected gauge reads, "Empty," when we have no usable fuel on board. We are now spaceworthy.
You have to be joking. You are telling me that a disconnected gauge is what the feds are requiring for a spaceworthy ship?
It meets the requirements, and I checked with the Space Standard District Office. They approved it as it was carefully calibrated to read zero when we were out of fuel. The feds did not like the posted note with the word "Enough" written on it. It was not spaceworthy. They don't like posted notes. They may fall off in flight.
So the feds believe that this regulation and policy works to keep spacecraft from running out of fuel.
They shouldn't. It doesn't seem to be effective. Spacecraft run out of fuel all the time and crash. The feds want to train the pilots to be better about fuel management, and not rely on the fuel gauge to tell them how much fuel they have. Don't you see? Pilots that rely on the required fuel gauge and run out of fuel are not as careful as I am. I check my fuel pre-flight and perform in-flight calculations.
I thought pilots are taught to rely on gauges for flight. that they should rely on the required gauges in the instrument panel.
Are you completely out of your mind? Why would I ever trust a gauge that in your words only has to let me know I need to land immediately?
This fuel gauge thing is so confusing, so I can trust some required instruments on the panel but not others. Is there a list I should review, just in case?
There is no list. You should trust all required instruments with the exception of the fuel gauge. End of subject.
Okay, it doesn't make much sense. But you are the pilot. I have a new question. Why did you offload some boxes and then tell 2 passengers to get off the spacecraft?
I did not want to take off overweight.
I am really struggling here. I am having a hard time understanding you at all, today.
Well, I only know exactly how much fuel I have when the tank is full. And I need an exact amount to calculate how long we can travel. We can't carry full fuel and full load, so I got rid of excess weight to make my fuel calculations easier.
I have a concept, please listen carefully. What if we used a fuel instrument that worked and let us know ahead of time we are running out of fuel for any reason? Even better, this fuel gauge would let us know how much fuel we put on the spacecraft before we took off. What if it even confirmed our remaining fuel calculations in flight? Even better, what if we could trust this fuel gauge like we trust the other required equipment on the instrument panel?
That's crazy talk. Fuel gauges have always been bad. Don't you watch old movies? It is the aviation way. If you were right, and that type of gauge was better and would help prevent fuel starvation and crashes, the Federal Space Administration would let us know right away. I am out of here. I have a GoPro movie to edit.